China is an economic powerhouse, the second largest economy in the world, worth $17 trillion. Time and again, we've told you about the power of the Chinese checkbook, how it's used to bury independent countries under Chinese debt. Now, what if I told you that China is running out of cash, that the Chinese government is unable to fund local governments? There's a big hole in China's budget. Do you know how big? Close to $1 trillion. Local governments in China are struggling to make ends meet. They've been forced to adopt cost-cutting measures. And yes, all of this is happening in China, the rising superpower. It's now borrowing cash. So how did China run out of money? Well, two reasons. Number one, the Wuhan virus surge, and number two, the collapse of the Chinese real estate sector. We'll talk about problem number one first. China is still dealing with its biggest Wuhan virus wave. Its response is a sweeping lockdown, and this has hit the Chinese economy hard. Economic activity came to a grinding halt. So the government's revenue has shrunk. Problem number two, the real estate sector. It is a big source of revenue for the Chinese state. How does the Chinese state make money from real estate? By selling land use rights. What are land use rights? This is basically a government approval. It is given to individuals and businesses to allow them to occupy and use land. Local governments in China depend heavily on this. In 2021, land use rights made up almost 50% of their revenue. But this year, there's been a big drop. Revenue from land use rights fell by 38%. If you've been watching this show, you would know why. The Chinese real estate sector has crashed. Several developers have defaulted recently. There are hundreds of projects that are yet to be completed. This is all snowballing into a major crisis. Home buyers have stopped paying their mortgages. More than 200 projects in 86 cities have been affected by this. And this is hurting China in a big way. So much so that several local governments could go broke. I have some estimates. How big is the deficit? Financial services company Nomura has a projection about 6 trillion yuan, or almost $896 billion. That's what they say. That is the funding gap, they say. Local governments need almost $1 trillion in China. There's another big problem, and that's debt. 30% of all local and regional governments are strained by debt. China has around 300 prefecture-level administrative divisions. Roughly 90 of these are struggling with debt. That's the estimate from S&P Global. How much money do these governments owe? A whopping $7 trillion. According to one estimate, this debt is in the form of loans and bonds. It represents 44% of China's GDP. So local governments in China are being squeezed. Their revenues have dropped, and they have loans to pay. So they're tightening their belts. They're cutting costs and expenses. Officials are being asked to print on both sides of paper. The use of air conditioners is being monitored. Officials cannot bring aides to meetings. There are curbs on buying stationery supplies. There are no notebooks and pencils for civil servants at meetings in some places. And yes, we are still talking about China, a country that gave loans worth trillions of dollars to the world, a country that trapped nations under the burden of debt. Now, Chinese local governments are caught in the same debt trap. They don't even have enough money to buy stationery. There's only one way to deal with this. Beijing has no option but to raise cash. And how do you do that in China? You borrow. So local governments are issuing more bonds. They've raised more than 4.4 trillion yuan already. That's around $656 billion. Now, who are these local governments borrowing from? From quote-unquote amateur investors. In other words, innocent citizens, people who don't really know what they're getting into. How are these bonds being issued? Through social media platforms like WeChat, believe it or not, and that's red flag number one. The second red flag are the terms of these loans. Local governments are issuing these bonds for as little as 100,000 yuan. That's around 15,000 US dollars. They're offering an interest rate of 10%. So why are local governments willing to pay a higher interest rate for such small investments? Because banks won't lend them the money. In the rest of the world, lending money to a government is considered one of the safest investments. But in China, it carries a huge risk. And that's because the government has high levels of borrowing. China's total debt is 264% of its GDP, 264% of China's GDP, and that is not sustainable. But China manages to carry on. It keeps plugging the holes in its finances with more debt. But you see, no financial system can defy gravity, and China is no exception. Its borrowing spree is hitting its limits. Beijing built itself a mountain of debt, and the same debt is consuming the Chinese state. WION is now available in your country. Download the app now and get all the news on the move.